Good evening, everyone. I'll call to order the workshop for August 13th, 2018. Kristen, if you want to do our roll call. Here.
Here.
Here. Councilmember Jones?
Here.
Councilmember McGough?
Here.
Councilmember Miller?
Here.
Mr. Pfeiffer.
I'd like to move to excuse John Marriott from this evening's affairs.
All votes are cast. That passes 6-0. We will reluctantly excuse Mr. Marriott. Okay, Mr. Devon, we've got 2 workshops tonight.
Yes. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we're going to have Will Tucker presenting or introducing the presentation of their Hometown Colorado Initiatives presentation. Some of you, I think, were at in the City Hall atrium a couple of months ago, and we actually had a display out and some presentations were made there. But this is a more formal presentation that Will has put together for our council and community to view. Thanks, Will.
Yeah, Mr. Tucker.
All right. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. I'm Will Tucker with the Planning Department. Just a real brief introduction. I had the opportunity to work with CU faculty and CU students to help put this project together. Really multifaceted to help us meet our comprehensive goals and strategic goals. But before I get into it, I'd like to turn it over to some members of the faculty, Jesse and Maria, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on last names right now, so please come up and introduce yourselves. Or Maria.
Thank you. Let's see here. Cool. So thank you, the City of Arvada, for having us. My name is Maria Delgado, and I am stepping in as the new faculty director for Hometown Colorado Initiative, which will now be housed in the brand new City Center. So City Center is going to be the new virtual front door of the university, and it's essentially trying to connect external partners with the university itself. So the mission of Hometown Colorado really is shares the mission with City Center as well, in terms of trying to connect local Colorado communities with the university expertise in order to problem solve and find solutions that will help advance the quality of life for all Coloradoans. So with the CU Arvada partnership, there were 17 projects that were completed over the past 2 years. The first five projects were completed in the academic year of 2016, and then it exponentially grew. It doubled in size for the academic year of 2017, where there were 12 projects that were completed. So our students at the University of Colorado, Denver, and faculty looked at projects that were associated with the city of Arvada in terms of water conservation, attainable housing, arts and music, parks, urban development, and infrastructure. So overall, there were a lot of benefits to not just the city, but our faculty and staff as well. Some overall benefits to the students is that they get real-world experience, which is different than a typical maybe textbook classroom, and really invaluable, very valuable. And then for other benefits that are for faculty and students is that they get to practice some of their latest research techniques that they've learned. In addition to, there's a very personal connection with working with real people and actual projects. So some benefits that we feel the city experienced in talking to city members, they felt very energized with some of the out-of-the-box ideas that students and faculty members presented. The city also benefited from the student and faculty time and resources that was allotted towards all of the different projects. And also, I feel like as a city, it's great that you guys get to be at the forefront of implementing innovative ideas. So for today's agenda, we're going to review the 5 projects that were done in the academic year 2016. And then after that, we will discuss the 12 projects that were done during the 2017 year, where there were 6 projects for the fall and spring semester. And what was great about this year, that some of the projects were distributed over the entire year, so it allowed for a lot of in-depth study and great quality of student work. So with that, I will pass it to Jim. Great.
So I had the pleasure of working with 5 classes in this hometown initiative. The very first one we did was Garden in a Box update. We partnered with the Center for Resource Conservation, now called Resource Central. They're a group, a nonprofit group that focuses on water conservation projects. The project here with the students was take a look at the Garden in the Box offerings, try and do a practical example, which we were able to do with some volunteers and a person who needed a little bit of help with their yard. It was actually very successful. They came up with 7 different designs, which we've turned over to Resource Central, and they've been trying to incorporate those into their annual products that they offer to everybody. The next one we did was Alice Sweet Thomas Park. We did a quick master plan on that one. This is a large storage tank, which was done in 1970s. At this point in time, it was basically grassed. We put the tennis courts on top, a couple of basketball courts, and it's been that way for the past 40 years. In conjunction with possibly doing some improvements to the roads at 80th and Sims, we looked at what would happen if they came in, took some of the land for roadway purposes. We would end up really redoing the entire park at that point. So we asked them for a number of concepts on how we could change it around, how we'd make this park a lot more user-friendly, putting in walking trails and much more visually interesting designs. Next one we did was water budget analysis. A very interesting one where we would had a program that would take a look at what should be the amount of water you put on your property versus what was actually put on your property. And based on that, we'd be able to sit down and say, okay, these are the areas where we need to do a lot more surveying. Why are people using more? What kind of programs could we offer to lower their consumption? That's one that was pretty ambitious for the students. They never quite got it done. We haven't picked it up because we sat down and said, okay, once we get this done, what are we going to do with it? And it would be a lot of resources that we would need to put into it to really make it successful. So it's kind of on the back burner at this point. But a very interesting one, and we'll someday, I think, move forward with a rather interesting project. The next ones we did.
Ms. Ford's got a question?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. On the water budget analysis, when it talks about water being accounting for a third of a household use, is that the annual average?
Actually, it's about 50-50. You use about half your water indoor and half of it outdoor. That was some of the things we were starting to get into with the students, but unfortunately the year ended at that point.
And that's annual average, or is that just in the summertime when people are watering?
Summertime, it's actually about 2/3 of your usage is outside.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Fleet maintenance, park and fleet maintenance building. This was one we worked with the engineering students on. They came in, did a tremendous amount of work, talking with the staff, looking at the needs of this particular building. We've had previous studies done in the entire Wadsworth site, and the cost of doing all the work we had planned out there was in the neighborhood of about $16 million. That included changes to the salt dome area, to the existing building, and replacing this particular structure. Based on the students' work, we came up with a pretty good price as to what it would cost to just replace this part of it, just the building itself, which is in the worst shape. With council's approval, we now have money being budgeted for that, and we're moving forward with actually making this project come forth. So we're in the process right now of taking a lot of the students' information. We're going to hand it off to a consultant, come up with a detailed plan, and then move forward with construction in 2019. And then the Ralston Water Treatment Plant facility, we're doing a bunch of work out there, primarily on improvements to a number of our facilities that are underground and with the security system. So we've torn up a lot of the ground, particularly in an entryway. So we had talked with the students about coming in, what would you want to see when we replant this entire area? They came up with some very interesting ones. One was a peak to prairie type of a landscape concept where you go from kind of a tundra area through a little forest and out into the plains. Another one was a color one where you'd have a different color that would kind of work its way across the entire area during the summer months, spring and summer and fall months. This is one that, again, we need to finish the construction before we can really get into going farther with this one.
Okay, Ms. Ford.
Yes.
Jim, I had a question on the fleet maintenance building. There were two areas on this paper that talked about low overall quality due to poor upkeep. What does that refer to?
The current building we're in, we're about the third or fourth owner. And when it was initially built, it was built fast. It was kind of thrown up by the first owner back in the 70s and not really well maintained until we took it over. So a lot of deterioration has already occurred, and we've had it for the past 20 years. There's stuff we just can't fix. So it's just that far gone.
Okay, and so that was more due to the prior users of the building.
Fairly cheap initial construction.
That makes me feel a lot better. There was one other question too, where they talked about the storage and organization of parts, materials, and tools throughout the facility are not functionally sufficient. What does that mean?
We basically took what was an old storage facility and turned it into workshops. We have people, actually, their workstation is right next to all of this. It just doesn't work well. The building was never really properly, it wasn't designed initially for what we were doing. We managed to make it work. So, for example, we don't have enough space in some of the bays for all the mower equipment that's in there. There are times they'll have to move 3 or 4 pieces of equipment out to get to the one they need to use, and then they got to put everything back. You can spend half an hour just getting to the proper piece of equipment. So that's kind of what we're getting into with a lot of this stuff. It's just not really designed well for what we're trying to do anymore.
And I have another question. Excuse me, this has more to do with consumers on the garden in the box, because this is actually a question that I've had for my own gardens. How do consumers really know when plants have been established where they can use less water? And I mean, obviously, I know this has to do with the type of plant as well.
Yeah.
But can consumers go anywhere to identify information that would help them to understand how to water plants and when they become established to slow down the watering and at what point or at what amount can they slow down the watering?
Offhand, I can't think of a particular site that would give you all that kind of information. I've been on the CU Extension websites. They have quite a bit of information, but you do have to plow through a lot of data to get to what you're looking for. I'll take that idea back to our group and see if we can't put together something on our webpage.
Okay, great.
That would get there.
Thanks, Jim.
And the next one is not mine. Mr. Ed Talbot.
Evening, Ed.
Evening to the mayor, members of council. Glad to see you here. Before I start off making any remarks, I wanted to say one thing that's very important. And I want to thank the University of Colorado for the work that you guys put into it, and especially for the commitment and dedication of the students I worked with on these projects. I was impressed when I went before the classes to answer questions from them. They were probing, they were intelligent, and they were interested in what was going on. So it was a good experience. I wanted to thank you for offering that opportunity to us. So there's really 3 projects. And the first one, 2016, was senior and workforce housing in Arvada. And there's really 2 components of this. Was by way of survey, obviously through the hard work of the students involved, is to take a look at senior housing and at workforce housing in terms of trying to obtain from a sample of folks that would respond to a survey their concerns, issues, or characteristics relative to their housing situation as seniors or as employees at 2 major employers in the city, of how they would respond as well. So there was a report that was generated, and I think two things maybe to point out just of interest on the seniors housing side. It was interesting that the result was that a lot of the seniors are in a situation they could afford the unit they're in. Obviously, for a lot of them, the mortgage was paid off. Where the concern cropped up is they wanted to stay in place or stay in the community. Their concerns about finding other affordable housing options they could obtain that would also fit their needs. There was also some expression of concern about some of the features in their housing as to how it might be appropriate for their needs as they age. So that was an interesting result, not maybe enormously surprising, but it was interesting to see. On the workforce side, there was really kind of two. For those that responded that were already living in Arvada, generally the incomes were fairly significant for the folks that responded. They were in a position they were doing okay generally in terms of their satisfaction with their housing situation. Where the difference came up is for those that were living outside the city that may want to move into the city. And that's where there's much more of a concern that was expressed as to their options to find affordable, appropriate units for them and their families if they wanted to move into the community. So that was the first survey. That work was done, obviously, and I think we concluded that, remember, at the end of 2016. The second really has two parts. And this was Arvada sites for attainable housing. And think of it as two phases. The first, it was almost like a process of filtering, is to basically go look at look at land parcels in the city, and let's basically filter down to see if we can identify those types of sites that might have potential for affordable housing development, given the criteria at the different filtering levels. So they started out with every housing parcel within the city. They got down, first cut obviously was to vacant land parcels, and there was around 1,800 of those, but that covered a wide range in terms of how they defined it. Then they got down to 34. And that pretty much concluded the first phase of the study. It was the second phase that really got down to looking at those 34 sites where there was a much more intensive look. They did site visits to the sites. They gathered a variety of information of those sites based on the filters they had established. And they came up with 11 sites that had, in their analysis, the potential to be appropriate sites for attainable housing development. Remember, this is not something to say there's a plan by the city or anyone else to do anything with those sites. This was to take a look at, to find out what sites might have characteristics that might show some potential. As part of that, on the second phase, they also took the time to conceptualize on 3 of the sites what would affordable housing potentially look like in terms of a site design for the site. So they picked 3 sites of kind of varied characteristics and try to basically just display an idea or ideas about what an attainable housing site plan might look for those sites. So that plan just was wrapped up the last couple of months, and we are making use of that. I am going to be meeting with Ryan and Daniel and with Maureen to take a look at that study to see what use it might be for them in terms of potential marketing or providing information to those that might be interested in Arvada for looking at some sites. Frankly, that's the question I get when I get calls. They want to say, Ed, where can we look to find some places that might be good to look at to potentially purchase for attainable housing? I don't have such information. This at least gives them a starting point. Now it's static, okay? This isn't going to be something that's upgraded periodically, but for the period of time it's done, it gives a good starting point. And so that was the 3 projects we did.
Thanks. Yes, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Talbot. What's the timeline on that to talk to Maureen and Ryan and Daniel?
I believe it's, what's today, Monday? Wednesday. Wednesday or
Thank you.
Thursday? 4 o'clock, Wednesday or Thursday. I'm sorry, I'll have to check my calendar. But I'm going to be meeting with them to actually take a look at the study. And if there's interest, kind of a little old-fashioned, but we actually prepared the document itself. It's online, obviously that's a much more economic, environmentally sensitive way to go, but I think sometimes people want something in their hand. So I do have some of these here. If there's interest in them, I'd be happy to obviously get these to you.
Great.
So.
Thank you, Mr. Talbot.
Oh, this is Ryan, by the way. Ryan. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Thanks for having me. We worked on, oh, you had one more, Ed? Or is this, Okay, all right, good. All right, so we worked on 2 projects as well. One of them was 2 parts, so first and second semester. We were able to work with a group of students on a arts and economic development study. We also got the Arts and Cultural Commission involved and had that discussion. So the first semester was really kind of breaking down and doing brainstorming and idea generation. And so we came up with 20 different types of projects that really scoped out the intersection between arts and economic development and created all these different ideas that could be implemented in order to sort of encourage the arts and how they supported economic development efforts within the city, and came up with these great ideas. And at the end, through a combination of staff and the Arts and Cultural Commission and some other stakeholders, we said which 5, or actually we started with 5, it went back down to 4 due to class size, projects could we work on. And so we studied in the second semester 4 of these. So it was a summer concert series, a tour de park series, a database that really engaged who is our creative class and who are our artists in our community, and then a kind of a newsletter that combined with making sure that our community could get connected with the arts. And so we had those work products kind of scoped out and really done. And in the case of things like the database and the newsletter, really gave us products that we could work on. And then there were business plans for things like the summer concert series and the tour de park, so that if we ever had the resources behind it, that we could hand over a map of said, this is how you can get it done, and kind of look at those types of things. So really innovative and thoughtful projects and things that we've been able to pass along to the Arts and Cultural Commission, so that if they are interested in incorporating that at their work plan or within their master plan, that's some information that could potentially help them.
Ms. Ford.
Yes, ma'am.
Ryan, is there any way that have we done a study yet of how arts in Arvada affects us economically?
You know, like an arts impact study?
Correct.
We have not done that specifically. I think that we have information anecdotally through some of our resources, and understanding that the Arvada Center has a huge role to play in those types of things. But directly to kind of put a number that you've seen, that some organizations will say the arts community in this does X amount of dollars as an economic impact. We have not studied that directly.
Is that something that the hometown initiative could do in the future, or would that require a different route?
You know, it's a good question. Probably at a fairly high level, we could work with a group of students. The students that we work with here come from certain schools. So this was the music school, and then we had others that were in the School of Architecture. There were other schools that other worked with. So we would probably need to make relationships with the people in the finance school and those types of things. So if those avenues were open to us, then I think that they would have the talent and resources to do it, and we could probably partner something like that to scope something like that out if a professor kind of had a special interest in that and wanted to take that on.
Okay. Yeah, I'm wondering if the CBCA, and I think that's the right acronym, and don't ask me what that stands for, I forget, but something about the Business for the Arts, if they might have some type of, I don't want to say template, but some approach that they use for the state, or that they recommend for individual cities.
Yes. It's difficult because you don't necessarily, not all artists are registered businesses and those types of things. So you need to know where you're making your assumptions are and when you're stopping. And so there'd be obviously limitations to what you'd truly know. But I think that you could generalize it fairly well and kind of understand it from some of the data points that we have.
Okay, thanks.
The second group that we worked with was a workforce study. And so we know that workforce is one of the most challenging aspects of business today. If we talk to the business community, they will say that the number one thing that's holding their business back from growing is access to workforce. Our unemployment rate is at 2.4%. You know, historic lows. The national unemployment rate is at 3.9%. There's just not enough folks to do all the work that needs to be done, even though we have incredibly talented people. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is kind of study the economic development landscape a little bit backwards, not saying, what do we have here necessarily that's going to attract business, but where are the workers? What type of workers do we have? And then how can we use our workers as a vehicle of saying we've got a lot of these workers and therefore we have a surplus of engineers or artists or whatever, and therefore that's something that we could use as a tool in order to attract businesses and say, you know, we have a surplus of engineers or IT folks. The information that we gathered was fascinating and very interesting. We looked at lots of different kind of segments of different industries and said, you know, what do we have a competitive advantage in and those types of things. And so we see that we are, you know, really good in engineering and IT, and some of those workers who are attracted to Colorado. We did not find, not surprisingly, because our unemployment rate is at 2.4%, a huge surplus of employees in any particular area, but we did find the opportunity that we are good in a lot of these areas because Colorado and Arvada in particular is able to attract a certain type of worker. And so we kind of learned the process of that, yes, understanding what you have a surplus in could be a tool in order to bring people in, but since that surplus wasn't here, what type of workers are you good at attracting? And that's also there. And then what kind of workers can come here and earn a wage that will fit a little bit into our demographics and our housing and those types of things, because that all plays into the competitiveness of being able to locate a business. And so fascinating information, a lot of good recommendations, and I don't think that it's anything that's necessarily actionable in the, okay, we're going to do this because this is what the report says, but adds a lot of color and information to the work that we've been doing in order to add depth of knowledge and expertise, so as we're talking to people, we have that enhanced subject matter expertise. So, next, I think Gordon is going to come up and talk a little bit about his projects, and Mr. Lee.
Mayor and members of City Council, Mike and I wanted to present on the 3 projects that we worked on with the Hometown Colorado students. The first one, as well as all 3 of them, come directly from our park master plan. In each case, there are strategic results that were recommended in the master plan, and working with the students, we were able to create a lot of action and headway in each of these areas. The first one is we spent the last year in a 2-phase program to really understand community agriculture and develop an agricultural master plan. In the first semester, we really focused on the policy side of community agriculture, working with the students to really look at what cities in the country are doing community agriculture the best, and if we wanted to be among the best in the country, what would be the policies that we would have in place that would meet that? Once we looked at that, we spent the last year with the students of the community in the landscape architecture program, and we focused on the second phase, which was basically to take the research and apply it to city-owned properties that lent themselves to community agriculture functions. So we spent time really examining what the Moore Brothers Farm could be. We looked at other properties in the park system that were 5 and more acres and what commercial agriculture functions they could serve. We stitched together the community gardens and the larger 1-acre production gardens, and in the process of that created kind of an entire plan. With this one, as well as the 2 other projects, our next step would be to go to the Park Advisory Committee share the knowledge that was gained in these studies, and then ultimately be back with to City Council. The second project that Mike is going to talk about is urban parks as a green strategy, and the desire that we really had in the park master plan to focus on an urban park typology that we've not really had before in Arvada.
Before Mike starts, Ms. Ford.
Gordon, have we looked into the possibility of using our community parks in terms of the gardening for people who are either homeless or maybe drug addicted? Or I know there have been some programs done in other cities. I believe they were nonprofit based, but where people did work on farms and.
We did. We captured some of the best programs in the country in the first semester. In the second semester, we built some concepts based on that research that, for instance, includes an edible trail system. So we found two great locations in the trail system that would lend themselves to gleaning and planting an edible trail component adjacent to the trail that could be maintained by the groups that you mentioned.
Okay, great.
These are different edibles than sometimes we hear about, right?
Yeah, a lot of fruit and
Very good, very good.
vegetables.
Okay, Mr. Lee.
Thank you, Mayor, members of City Council. This project started out as I thought we were going to work on McElvoy Park and maybe the renovation of McElvoy Park. So I first met the students at McElvoy. We talked about all the issues, and as you know, there have been a lot of changes in that area in terms of population, in terms of the use of that park. And so we talked about some of the issues with the park, but the students were so interested in so many other things that what I did is then took them on a tour of Old Town, and we looked at Grandview and the crossing across Wadsworth and the little plaza we created there, the transit plaza. Then we went to the Old Town Plaza, and all the time they were asking me questions. We were looking at materials, we were looking at design, we were looking at different things. So we had a lot of ideas. We talked about some of the issues, and there's the issue of Old Town and New Town, and so as there were a dividing line between them, and the students felt that there should be a difference of materials between Old Town and New Town. So we talked about strategies there, different benches, different site furniture, different lights, and different paving, all those sorts of things. So, and we talked about some of the other issues in terms of the connectivity and the pedestrian movement. So then they went back, and then I went down to UCD and spent quite a bit of time with the class, and we talked about all sorts of things, and they'd obviously been thinking and doing a tremendous amount of research. So it was moving along, and as it went from McElvoy Park to this broad vision of urban park as a green strategy. They stuck right to the park master plan. And in the master plan, you'll see we talk about green spines. And basically, those are the canal corridors and all the waterways that the city's lucky enough to have that move through the city. The canals kind of go north-south, so those are the green spines. So what they talked about is some different study projects and some really opportunities in Old Town. And we had to define a new park type just because an urban park isn't a traditional park. It could be just a plaza. The Old Town Square is a perfect example of an urban park. It's not necessarily a sea of grass. Grass might be just a design element. Like in the plaza, we have a small patch of grass. So this started to manifest itself, and so they said, well, where else should we look? And I go, well, Old Town's a good example. We can walk around and see little small spaces that we can make into green areas or seating areas. But I said, Ralston Creek, there's some opportunities in that urban renewal development to do some exciting things there in terms of urban park. You know, don't turn your back on the creek anymore. There's this amenity, this tremendous amenity there. And we also, when we designed Ralston Central Park, created an axis that we hoped that would continue east-west that the development there to the west would take advantage of. Another opportunity is in the area, and students got all excited about this stuff, but 80th and Wadsworth, the shopping center there, the Greenway Trail goes right through, or Little Dry Creek goes through, and under Wadsworth, nobody even knows it's there. But there's a tremendous opportunity, and that's a part of this green strategy that indeed we could take advantage of these things in terms of redesign, in terms of trail connections, and that's shown in the master plan as a possible area, underpass area under Wadsworth. So they came up with some really exciting things and tremendous work. I can't say more good about that group, and they actually energized me a little bit too, so thanks.
Then our third project is increasingly relevant given the timing of the Gold Line, and that's looking at strategies on how we can activate the transit stations. The work that we did with the Hometown Colorado Initiative students really focused on the Kipling Ridge Station, the relationship that we have with Red Rocks College and their holistic health programs, and the planning work that's been going into the design of Holistic Health Park. So we're able to take all of those things together and come up with a strategy that not only influences the design of the park, but then how we do outreach and bring people there and really activate it to students at school, the adjacent new neighbors in the Embry development, and then the surrounding area. So this will be another plan that's been developed that we'll be able to implement, not have it stay on the shelves, but very relative, very important information that we can implement as the Gold Line opens, as the development continues and Holistic Health Park is constructed. And our next presenter is back to Will.
All right, hello again. So just a disclaimer here, this was a project that was done in conjunction with Public Works. Bob Waring did a lot with this project, and for whatever reason, he didn't want to come out of retirement to come back tonight to talk about this project. So I'm going to do the best I can to cover for him in the interim. So a constant issue or something that's brought up pretty frequently is the availability of parking in Old Town and how to find it. And so the students were tasked with what can be done to accommodate this demand, and this is the results that they have come up with. So they had 6 different areas that they wanted to, or 6 different studies they wanted to use to analyze demand within Old Town and kind of come up with travel demand management. They wanted to, 1, market demand for living in Old Town, travel survey visitors and employees in Old Town, do an inventory of all the parking, perform parking observations, do a grocery store and market study, and lastly, read over case studies of other travel demand studies in other cities. Some of their methodology was based around sending out surveys to different businesses just to see what they experienced driving throughout the city, what their behavior was, how often they searched for a parking spot, and how long it took them, and just how they felt generally about parking in Old Town. They also did a walking survey and just would stop and ask people, kind of perform an intercept survey to see how they enjoyed traveling in Old Town and some of the challenges they faced. They also used GIS to survey underutilized or vacant parcels. You'll see in the map that's up right now are some of those parcels they're referring to. And they also performed a market study to see if we could support a large-scale grocery store. So some of the recommendations that they came up with was to allow for more flexible parking requirements, to allow these areas that are already densely built and struggling to accommodate more parking to pursue things like shared parking with the neighbors and things of that nature. It's something that we do pursue right now. We do allow shared parking agreements, and if somebody has different operating hours, we have in the past allowed people to kind of stagger those hours to accommodate more parking. They also recommended that those businesses that are in the denser areas that see more intensity because of their land use change their parking hour restrictions from 2 hours to 1 hour. They're also looking for requiring paid parking in the parking structure, which I think is something that's being floated right now. Provide better wayfinding to the parking structure so people have a better sense of place of where they're going to. Again, I think that's something else that's being worked on. And lastly, they also talked about providing more convenient bus routes throughout the city, specifically going down Old Wadsworth. They mentioned that it might be a problem for mobility for maybe those that are disabled. And talking with our traffic engineers is something that they are aware of, but the maneuverability of these large buses going through Old Town is pretty difficult. So they are aware of the issue, but are kind of struggling to come up with a way to accommodate better routes. While I'm limited with the knowledge on this, since Bob is not here, I'll do my best to answer any questions with that, but if not, be sure to get back to you on it. All right, and this one I was involved on. This was done with the School of Public Affairs. What they were looking for is to kind of audit our engagement strategies for development. And this is at all different levels. They wanted to look at face-to-face, what kind of methods do we use to engage the city to the citizen, what are our digital platforms, what do we use to communicate via Facebook or Nextdoor, that sort of thing. They also wanted to do an audit of our internal communication, how staff communicates with one another, what do we do to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And lastly, they did a root cause analysis to see what is really generating any issue that may be coming about. Ultimately, they said, when looking at other cities and comparing it to Arvada, they believe we do have good communication. But they did want to come up with some strategies and some recommendations for us to improve upon. One of the issues that they saw is that there is early public engagement early on with our neighborhood meeting, and that those items that do go to public hearing take a minimum of 22 weeks to see Planning Commission, then another 5 weeks to get to you all at City Council. So there's a good number of months that happen between the first engagement and then when actually the first public hearing happens. So they were exploring ideas of maybe setting up more community engagement along that timeline to kind of check in and see where it is. We also explained that we do have our eTrack-It system, which is our internet database to house all of our applications. And that is something that is public information that anybody from the public can access to see where we are in the process. But it may not be the most intuitive program, but it is an avenue that the students thought that we could use to better communicate where we are in our review process so they don't feel so disconnected from the beginning and towards the end. Other recommendations were continue to utilize our online presence. They did like that we were using Nextdoor and communicating via Facebook. They did have a recommendation that staff should have a better conduit, I guess, with council. I did explain to them there might be some legality issues, but they thought that maybe if some of the issues were, or potential questions that you may have for staff are communicated, kept internally to staff, so staff can be better prepared to get ahead of that. But overall, they thought what we did very well was our internal communications with using, our internal version of Track-It to communicate with one another, as well as our weekly community development and development review team meetings. We talk about every project almost every week that's active. We talk about pre-application meetings coming up, and they were just impressed that we had such an open conversation and dialogue with that to keep everybody on the same page. So from my standpoint, it was a great project. I really enjoyed working with them. Communication and organization of neighborhood engagement is something that I'm unfamiliar to, so it was great to work with CU and kind of get that exposure for myself and see what the students were bringing to the table. I believe that is the last one, so I will turn it back over to Maria for closing statements.
Before you do that, Ms. Ford?
I have a question for you. And I'm so glad you said you were
So close.
an expert communication. One of the things that I'm concerned, and I'm wondering if I'm concerned for no reason, given the fact that Arvada has a higher age population, in your research, have you looked at email or internet and email and all the computer uses versus actual reading material, newspapers and reports and that kind of thing in terms of neighborhood engagement specifically?
Absolutely. There's the students were aware of the accessibility to some of the communications on the internet, and not necessarily just a generational difference, but a equity for different income. That not everybody has ability to use Nextdoor, has access to a cell phone, social media, whatever. So I believe that they were also promoting more of that face-to-face to kind of fill that void. I don't believe they came to a final recommendation on how to achieve that without doing some other social media marketing to get us into a face-to-face conversation, but it is something that we could pursue further with students if we continue HCI, or something that we can do internally. But I don't believe there is formal research that says this percentage of this demographic uses our Nextdoor system versus the newspaper or something along those lines.
I wonder if that wouldn't be a bad research project to do, because even from the standpoint of preferential, just because a person has a computer doesn't necessarily mean they enjoy using the computer and they want to engage in the computer. And whether that's and I don't think that has anything to do with age or ability, or to me it makes me think it might be a good research project, because I'm wondering if we're missing a lot of our constituents by solely doing things over the internet and through electronic means.
Sure, absolutely. It's something that we would like to pursue more. What is difficult to really capture is who you are reaching with social media platforms. A lot of that media or information is privatized. A lot of people have skepticism about social media due to the reality that a lot of it might not be private information. It might be out in the public. So that's something that we can't really tap into. We had difficulty finding out who is the age range. So we're limited there, but absolutely, mailing surveys or something along those lines to get feedback from citizens to see what their preferred method is, and creating an inventory based on that could certainly be an avenue.
Great. Mr. Pfeiffer? I think I'm all right. Okay. Looks like we've got questions answered. Let's get back to our folks from CU to wrap it up.
So I would like to thank all of you guys for so eloquently speaking on behalf of your experience with the students and the faculty. And just as a highlight, just to kind of summarize, there were 17 projects in total completed, so 17 reports that came with even more detailed information. Throughout this 2 years, 200 students were positively impacted by being able to work with the city of Arvada. We had dozens of faculty members, and we estimate over 70,000 hours of work, experience, and hard work that went into getting these results to you guys. So I did want to also say, Ms. Ford, if there are any other ideas from the city of Arvada, anyone, we have students that are ready and able that would love to continue to help out the city. And so we feel that, I know the students have felt that they have done a positive impact by working with the city of Arvada, but also you guys, by creating this opportunity, have positively impacted our students. So I thought it would be nice to end on 3 remarks, 2 from a student and 1 from a faculty member, just in their own words, so that you can hear their voice of how this experience was shared. So the first one, all of these 3 individuals worked actually on the agricultural master plan. And so the first individual, her name is Kat. She's a Master's of Landscape Architecture student entering her 2nd year this year. And she stated, "Our class studio project was an exciting opportunity to produce something tangible for a real-world client. As a whole, I think our class gained valuable experience in designer-client communication. Progressing from detailed site-specific design proposals to city-wide planning allowed us to gain better understanding of the design process." So her co-peer, Marty, as well entering his second year this year, said, "Arvada is motivated to reinvigorate their past to create a new future. The most enriching part of the experience was working with the city and watching them react to our ideas because they were so receptive to what the students have to offer. As a student, it was easy for me to be invested because I knew there were real people tied to the effects of our decisions." And Jody Beck, who was their professor, and I'll end with this quote, he said, "The Hometown Colorado Initiative," and he's speaking of this collaboration, "has been critical to developing my research and important to our teaching focused on city engagement. Over the last 3 courses I was involved in, I have developed a methodology to point that we have ended up with a truly groundbreaking proposal for the use of public space for food production in Arvada. Our students have been exposed to a wide variety of citizen groups and community interests, as well as how to work with municipal governments." So I want to thank you all on behalf of the University of Colorado for really providing such an amazing experience for our students and faculty. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You know, when this proposal was first given to us by Dr. Harrell and her team, as they came forward, and I talked to my counterpart, Adam Paul, in Lakewood, because they had done a much smaller scale program with you all, the sense of the opportunity here to have the enthusiasm of the students, the expertise of the professors, and then the expertise of our staff all working together, I think it was a classic win-win and an opportunity for all of us to benefit. Now, what I would urge for our city manager and for our staff, let's not just stick this on a shelf somewhere. Let's make sure that we refer to it, that we take the gems that are in it and mine them as effectively as we can as we move forward, so that we can really benefit from what has been a colossal amount of work by all involved. So thank you on behalf of the entire City Council.
Great. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, Mr. Devon, now we got an easy one.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, we're going to update you on the land development code, code module number 2. Rob Smentana will introduce this item, and then I believe we'll hear from Todd Messenger.
Thank you, Mark. Mayor, members of council, we are here tonight to talk again about the land development code and about the second module, which you received in your packet, and then to ask you your thoughts on 5 questions we have so we can get your initial thoughts on those, and then we'll take that information back to our advisory committee that we're working with as well. So just to give you an idea where we are in the timeline for the project, we're about halfway through at this point. We've had 1 open house to talk about Code Module 1. We're getting ready to go through that same process with Code Module 2, so that open house will be coming up here at the end of this month. And we are still on track at this point to have something before you at the middle of summer next year for adoption. So just briefly, I'm going to have Todd step up and talk to you about the code module you have in your packet, and then we'll run through some questions we have and get your initial thoughts on those.
Very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, just to walk you through really quick, Module 2, in case you haven't had the opportunity to read the whole thing or memorize it or whatever yet, just to give you the framework of it. So we had originally sort of laid out the code structure, and we had said there's a certain flow to things where you set it up for the property owner first, and then the property owner's realtor and landscape architect, and then finally through to the lawyers and ultimately to the judges. So at the end of the day, the people that have to read all of it are the people that you would want to punish that way, folks like me. In any case, the zoning districts and land use, they answer the questions, what can I do? How much can I do? What does it have to look like? What are the standards for particular uses? Those are the questions that we've now answered in the module that you've seen. And then, of course, we're putting the end of it, what do all these words mean anyway? The definition section, we add definitions as we go to make sure that we have a common vocabulary for everything in the code. In terms of use-specific standards, your current code has a number of use-specific standards in it, and that's because we anticipate that there are certain land uses that have predictable impacts or design implications that we want to deal with. Classic examples being like fast food drive-thrus and gas stations. So you want to have certain standards in place to make sure that those aren't as ugly as they can be or as dysfunctional as they can be, but to address them at the degree of quality that the city expects. So we have a number of different land uses that are like that. Those are the common examples, but we have now provided you some preliminary standards for a whole bunch of different land uses that we think that once we get an acceptable set of standards, perhaps these things can be decided with less process. We would be weeding out the applications that don't meet those basic standards so that they wouldn't reach a decision-making point. Uses that are designated in land use tables to be limited or conditional would be subject to use-specific standards. Limited uses would be decided by staff. Conditional uses would be decided through some larger public process that could either end with the Planning Commission or the City Council, depending on how the council wants to go at the end of this project. Use-specific standards are influenced by your existing code provisions because we assume that that's a starting point for what the city expects. But we did have to make some updates in order to dovetail those into your current land use tables, which are mismatched as a result of the work that we did on Article 5 that didn't spill over into these standards previously. You have a very complicated framework in Arvada for temporary uses. We carried it forward for now, but we're looking at ways to simplify this. I don't know if you've had the chance to look at your food truck vending provisions lately, but they go on and on and on, and we think it's probably unnecessarily complicated. So with your approval on this, we'd like to take a giant scalpel to these regulations and make them much simpler to do and have them administered typically on a staff level for things that are easy to approve. So there's some additional work to do in this regard. Business use of the home, we have standards now provided for home occupations, home child care, short-term rentals, and bed and breakfast uses. We'll talk about some of those issues tonight. We'd like to sort of work through those and make sure that we're allowing people to make as much economic use of their home as possible without being disruptive to the overall livability of the neighborhoods. We also now have addressed the issue of how much can I build. The tables now answer the question with respect to how much density, how much open space has to be provided. So we didn't get down to a non-residential intensity number, for example, a floor area ratio or something like that. The way that you constrain development on a non-residential site is by requiring a minimum amount of landscaping. And then when you're balancing between building height and parking, it limits the amount of development that can be done on that site. And so we have height, parking regulations, and open space. And the open space also helps us to maintain a certain physical character. So these standards are intended, in fact, to reinforce that desired character. Currently, your open space standards are use-based, so the same use in different contexts in the city would have the same open space. And we think it should be zoning district-based, and that's how we set it up. So an urban zoning district would have urban levels of open space, and a rural zoning district would have rural levels of open space. It wouldn't matter whether it was a church or a school or a shopping center or residential development in that context. We have standards for lots and buildings and structures. So those are your typical bulk standards like setbacks and height and so forth. And we created a housing palette, which is a concept we talked about very early on in this process, where you get a density and an open space allocation in each of the new residential zoning districts, 6 units per acre, 13 units per acre, 24 units per acre, and you have to provide a certain amount of open space. And then within whatever land that you have left to build on, you can build a variety of different housing products. And the housing palette tells you the minimum standard for each of those products. And that helps you, work within the contours of the land, preserve significant natural resources, create livable spaces around open spaces. We have Old Town standards that we simplified somewhat, tried to make them a little bit more user-friendly, but didn't do any real changes to, except to correct a couple of gaps and errors. And then lot and setback and building standards for non-residential and mixed-use zoning districts. So we provide sort of a first draft of the panoply of different bulk standards you'd expect. And they come in a little bit different format than you're used to, but I think it's a productive format in terms of promoting flexibility. We recalibrated the work we previously did on the sign code to accommodate the reduction in the number of zoning districts, and we reallocated the zoning districts into the sign district table so that it made sense based on the prior policies. And we were able to keep intact almost everything that we had previously done with the sign code. So that was time and money well spent. And I think the sign code project has so far been fairly successful. And so as we learn lessons as we go along, we can tweak it as we go. So with key topics, I think Rob and I were going to maybe tag team this, so I'll hand control back. Thank you very much.
So the first item we wanted to discuss with you is the one that is a little more of a priority, and that's the fact that we have a self-storage moratorium in place right now. It was a 6-month moratorium, which will expire in early October. So we just wanted to get some initial direction on where you think we should be going with that at this point in time. So as we've drafted the code, we have, obviously, as Todd has mentioned, and you saw in the first 2 modules, we're looking at a number of different zone districts that don't match up with what we have in the code today necessarily. So as we move forward, we need to keep that in mind in terms of how we want to approach the remainder of the moratorium period and what we need to do as that moratorium period ends. So the first, there's basically 3 options. One would be to let the moratorium expire and keep it in the existing zone districts where self-storage is permitted today, which is the PUDI, PUDBP, the I-1, and the I-2. Another option is to drop it from either of those 2 districts if you wanted to keep one but not the other. The most likely one there that caused the least amount of concern was the PUDI. I think the most amount of concern was in PUDBP. Or to just simply remove the PUD districts from the self-storage regulations today, remove the use from those 2 districts, and leave it in the I-1 and the I-2 district. That would be staff's recommendation at this point in time, so that we aren't necessarily continuing the moratorium along. And then as we look towards the new code, we think we have some new zone districts that would be implemented that are much more discrete in terms of allowing the self-storage use, where it would have the least impact on residential uses. And we would also want to look at maybe some additional design standards that would potentially reduce any negative impact on residential.
Okay, let's get answers from council. Staff recommendation is option 3, as I understand it?
Yes.
David Jones.
I would agree.
Dot Miller.
I agree.
Mark McGough.
Yes, as I had read this over, I was thinking, a key element is the distance from residential and the mass. And it seems like if we should not accept, or if we put it the other way, if we do accept the recommendation number 3 to remove them from the PUD, business professional, and industrial, and just go with the industrial 1 and 2, that would solve that problem. We would not be close to residential, and we wouldn't worry about the mass. Would that be correct?
Generally, that is the case. We have very few vacant parcels that are in one of those 2 zone districts that are adjacent to residential today. So,
and if they should be close to residential, that could still be considered in the plan. So,
yeah.
Yes, I favor alternative number 3.
Ms. Ford.
I too favor alternative 3.
So before I answer, I thought we had a moratorium to get a workshop to understand the impacts of this before deciding what we were proceeding. So I'm just a little shocked that we are doing this right now, but I'm looking at Mark Devon.
Well, Mr. Pfeiffer, what's the council's pleasure? I think there's options that we could, and city attorney could weigh in here, that we could extend the moratorium if that's necessary.
But I thought the moratorium was for us to study the issue a little bit more and understand the impacts of these in the way that they're in our ordinances today.
So,
but if that's not the case,
yeah,
then
my
maybe
understanding
I
was that the reason for the moratorium was to consider a direction that we might want to proceed within the context of the Land Development Code update.
Yeah, that's sort of my sense, is that this process is
part of it.
Is part of that.
This is kind of moved quicker than we had anticipated with the land development code, and we think we're hopefully in a good place where we can come back to you with those discussions.
I'm good with number 3.
I wholeheartedly endorse number 3, so. Next.
Next up, all right.
Do you have
Moving
a
right
sense that, how I feel about this stuff?
Yep.
Let's
So-
get questions answered.
So the next item we really want to have some thoughts from you folks about is short-term rentals. Right now, we don't allow short-term rentals within residential zones in the city, and that's basically anything less than 30-day rentals. So some of the issues to think about as we look at this option is that it would provide potentially property owners with additional income, and it can allow for tourists that we don't capture today to come to our city and provide some increased tax base. Of course, the cons can be that we would be potentially removing long-term rentals from that market, which could increase rents and really further restrict the rentals that we do have for folks that want to live here on a longer-term basis, and that it could impact neighborhood character. So some of the options to think about are some things that other cities have done. Other cities, such as Denver, have required licenses for these short-term rentals that have to be renewed on an annual or every other year basis, so we really can keep track of them. And if we do run into issues, we have an opportunity to review those licenses on a regular basis. We can also require that it be the primary residence for the landlord, so that you cannot rent out your entire house. You may be able to rent out a room or a portion, but not your entire structure. So there's some obligation to maintain a presence there. Along those same lines would be to allow one listing per parcel, so that you couldn't rent out multiple rooms to multiple people. On the flip side, some communities do allow whole house rentals. Fort Collins, as example, allows that. And then if we do include it in the land development code as a use, we can look at it as either simply an accessory use similar to what we do with home occupations today, or we can have a more robust process. And then if you're inclined to consider allowing these short-term rentals, we do think we need a smaller breakout group aside from the land development code that we would do in a very short period of time, but that would bring in some other folks that we don't have represented on the advisory committee today, just to kind of walk through some of the issues that are very specific to this particular topic. So with that, any thoughts on short-term rentals?
I'll start with Mr. McGough.
Okay, yes, thank you. Yes, I've given a lot of thought to this over the last few days and reading what some of the other cities are doing, and at this point I favor taking a longer look at it with a focus group. But some of the areas that I have concern about, of course, are the property rights of the owners. Right at the start, I think we've got to keep that in mind throughout. What might a person do with their own property? I have a problem with something that goes with somebody needing requiring the property be a primary residence for the landlord. That would seem to me that would take some kind of registration and tracking over the long haul to find out who is the owner. When does ownership change? How do we keep track of that? How do we enforce on that? I think that's a real problem to deal with, as we found out in Denver with their low-income home purchasing, where they did not keep track of it. They did not have a system set up, and of course that becomes more and more problematic as the years go by, because people sell residences, they move, they die, they divorce, whatever the case may be, and things change. And so having a requirement for that it be the primary residence of the landlord, I think is very problematic. I had a question as I read it over too that I think we could take a look at through this study group. That has to do with the licensing. And I was glad to hear you say just a minute ago that I took it to mean that one of the primary purposes of the licensing would not be just simply for some kind of revenue, but rather a registration to know who is the owner of record, that they are dealing with the property in a certain way, and that if problems or issues arise, we know who to deal with. And so in that way, I would favor the licensing just simply to have that information. I'm not sure that it's would ever get to the point that the licensing would be a revenue stream of any consequence. So those are just some thoughts, and I would very definitely favor having an advisory ad hoc committee to take a look at this and have it comprised of the constituent group that you mentioned here. Thank you.
Ms. Ford?
I definitely would like to see more information on this topic, to see what's been going on in cities and some of the problems that they've been incurring. I'm definitely in favor of licensing because I do think it is a business and it should be treated as a business, especially in residential neighborhoods. I think, you know, if these homes were in other neighborhoods, you know, I'm a little bit more okay with that. The other thing that I would be concerned about would be parking issues, especially if multiple rooms in a home were to be rented out. To me, that's a rooming house. And I think that we have to look at the intent and really look at the issues that it's going to cause. And I feel, too, that we have to be careful because we've identified neighborhood engagement as a very important piece of our comprehensive plan. And I tend to think that if we had too many of these types of homes in Arvada, that's going to affect, it has the potential to affect neighborhood engagement and just really not knowing who people are in your neighborhood. So I'd like to see a little bit more information on it.
Ms. Pfeiffer?
So, I mean, the one that stands out the most for me is actually having somebody, the primary resident, live there. And I think of a bed and breakfast, obviously, and you kind of oversee, because my concern is that we have a strategic goal to create vibrant communities and engagement. And I think when you have a churn of people, that there's no connection between maybe the property and the neighborhood, we're kind of going against ourselves and our goals around connected neighborhoods. So I think if you have like a bed and breakfast with the landlord still there, there's that continuity. And so I would like to shape the conversation around that if we can. So try not to contradict our other strategic goals as we go through this.
Your sense, Mr. Pfeiffer, is additional study?
Oh, yeah, sorry,
appropriate?
additional study,
Very
definitely,
good.
but highlighting this area is my concern.
Very good. Ms. Miller?
I feel like Councilmember McGough read all my notes because
He
I
did.
agree with him.
He was copying it.
Absolutely, word for word, what I thought.
I'm worried.
I did. I feel like I copied you too. But I would like to add that you know, I'm a big fan of Airbnb and VRBO, and I would like to say, Mr. Pfeiffer, that neighbors can welcome visitors that are coming to stay in there, have tea on the front porch, and celebrate all that Arvada has to offer, and recommend places to go, to restaurants and stuff. And we as Airbnb goers are very vibrant people in a community. So it's not all bad.
Good. Mr. Jones?
I'll start with the end in mind, that I would agree that more study is appropriate. But I'm just curious, do we currently collect lodging tax on like long-term rentals? Is that a part of?
No, not on long-term rentals, no.
Then on a short-term rental, what would be, and just as you've kind of thought through this, the justification around the lodging tax?
Well, that would be to match it up with a lodging facility, hotel,
So fitting
motel,
more of
so-
the Airbnb, VBRO model. So that's where that would come into.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And then, Is that, for instance, is that how Denver is approaching it, or Fort
Yes.
Collins, or
Yeah.
they're?
They all seem to have some kind of tax in place for them.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, it's, Airbnb and VBRO is something that's very prevalent. I mean, it's, we've done it a couple of times, it's, but normally it's near coastal communities, and that's what all of the, seems like everything is a VBRO. So it just feels, sometimes it feels a little disconnected in a community like ours. I'm not like Dot. I tend to like to stay at the hotel. But I think we just need to look at it in more detail, but certainly something that can impact our neighborhoods for good and bad. So.
I'm not going to be a contrarian here. I certainly believe we need to study this more. I see both the private property right issue, but also the neighborhood issues. The lady who came before us and spoke in public comment last month, I get it that, you know, you've got some homeowners, but then you've got these other properties that become monthly rentals and, you know, may not exactly maintain the property appropriately or other things. So I think your game plan that you have set forth for the things to consider, the group you're considering for the advisory committee, I think is excellent, and I would certainly want to have some public hearings and some public meetings so that we could really understand it a little bit better. I think it's premature to thumb up or thumb down at this point, but we need more information. Right.
Okay, sounds good.
Next one.
Next up, accessory dwelling units. We do allow accessory dwelling units today. We've allowed them since 2007. And the idea behind them was to provide for housing options, maybe to have some more affordable housing as a secondary unit, maybe also to provide a mix of housing in the community, and to provide an opportunity for additional income for somebody who would want to develop an ADU and rent it out. As of today, we have 8 Type A units. Those are the detached units that are either in a backyard or side yard. We have 11 Type B, and so those are basement units, or somebody maybe has added a second floor and separates the 2 units. And so we have 11 of those. And we have 25 of what we call Type C, which are not necessarily accessory dwelling units. They're more like the mother-in-law type unit. They can't be locked off, but they can have a separate kitchen. But they really are not intended for a separate rental use. So we also have a number of restrictions on ADUs. Depending on the size of the primary dwelling unit, the size range can be between about 400 and 800 square feet. All-day ADUs have to be a minimum of 200 square feet and can be used as studio 1 or 2 bedroom units. It can be no more than, if it's within a basement or a second floor, it can be no more than 50% of the size of the base dwelling unit. If it's less than 600 square feet in size, you can only have 2 residents of the ADU. If it's between 600 and 800, you can have 3 residents. We do require 1 parking space for each ADU, and we have a requirement for it to have similar materials to the primary structure. We also do require a deed restriction to be recorded, and that basically says that the property owner has to occupy either the primary dwelling or the ADU. And so we also have a prohibition as part of that deed restriction that basically says you can't subdivide the property and sell each one individually. The size of the ADU can be restricted to the approved size through the deed restriction. And it also says that you can't automatically convert a Type C to a Type B without coming back to the city for that to be reviewed. One of the issues we have there really is that when conditions change, somebody decides not to rent out their ADU or want to sell the property and don't want to have a deed restriction on it, it can be time consuming to remove that deed restriction. So that's one of the things we would like to talk about as we move forward. couple of other items. The height and the scale of ADUs. Today, you can build an ADU, a separate unit or addition to your home, to 35 feet in height, which is our height limit across the city. We may want to take a look at reducing that to the height of a typical residential structure in the neighborhood, which at this point we're kind of thinking that's around 27 feet. We need to look into that in more detail, but that's generally what we'd like to say for height in residential areas across the city. We also want to look at the maximum size of an ADU, if appropriate. Sometimes you have a much bigger house on a much bigger lot. Maybe you have a 3,000 square foot house on a half-acre lot. Do we still want to restrict that ADU to only 800 square feet? Or should there be some kind of sliding scale that the bigger your house, the bigger your lot, maybe the bigger your ADU can be? And then on corner lots, we've seen challenges with ADU development on corner lots, generally because there's really only you really can't put them in the backyard like most of the ADUs we have in the city, just because of configurations of corner lots. So we can either look at the possibility of reducing setbacks to make them more likely to fit on a side yard of a corner lot, or we can just say that we don't want any ADUs to be on a street frontage, and that would apply to any lot, corner lot or a standard lot, interior lot. We're also hoping to maybe take a little bit of a look at the idea of the similar material idea. Specifically, if an ADU is in the backyard and maybe is not visible from an adjacent street, are there some more modern types of architecture that could be considered for those ADUs that maybe make them a little more appropriate for light and maybe you can get away with a single plane roof versus some kind of hip or gable roof that might make drainage easier on a particular site. And then finally, the idea of the deed restriction. Is that something we would like to keep? Or, one option is simply to say, as part of the land development code, that an owner is required to live there and we can enforce on that rather than requiring a separate deed restriction. So those are the kind of the 5 big topics with ADUs.
Well, I'm going to start on this one. I do not want to see another ADU built like the one that was approved, where it was 64th and Ammons. Never, ever again, okay? Because that was I don't know if that was a corner lot, but it was certainly up front. So for me, no corner lots,
Okay.
and nothing that's on the street itself. I think it really needs to have good compatibility. I like the idea of them being smaller than the existing residences, and don't want them to be able to be, split the deed or subdivide it into separate properties. I think that's inconsistent with the concept of what we want for ADUs. That's my personal bias and opinion on this one. But so I think lowering the roof line, but making sure it stays compatible with the other properties. I think and God love her, what Shelley Cook did with hers was the epitome of what I like in an ADU. So there's mine. Dot?
I agree.
Mr. Jones?
Just a quick question, and I would agree with what the mayor said, but on the AD, as you described, the ADU units can be between 400 and 800 square feet, but yet we have a building height of 35 feet. Seems a little off.
Well, you can do them above a garage, and you can do a 2-story if it fits within
Okay. I
that.
guess I was thinking of like the detached version of that, but would that fall under the same guidelines, the detached?
That's what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they would both. If we want to look at lowering the height, it would apply to both types.
Yeah. So everything that the mayor said, but then how are we, as a city, are we going through the same building inspection process and making sure that these units are being built and comply with the standards?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And
Yeah,
we're
they do
checking
require-
those?
Yeah, they require building permits just like any other structure. Even those in the basement, they're required if they're doing new electrical or putting in walls, all of that requires
And if the
building permit.
pitch of the roof or the materials being used are not consistent with what's on the original structure, we're just being sure that, or are we saying, well, it's close enough?
Well, we're trying our best. It's a little vague in the way the language reads in the ordinance today. It says similar.
So I guess
that's open for interpretation, and that's one thing we're going to work on if we want to, obviously, if we want to continue allowing them, which is probably the case. We want to tighten that.
So I would make sure that we just look at that language to ensure that it either is or it isn't, so that there's no, well, it's similar to me, but maybe you're not seeing what I'm seeing. Because I have different color spectrum.
Yeah, there may be some flexibility too, whether it's visible from the street or the visibility of the unit, maybe there's a little more leeway.
Yeah.
In some instances, maybe there's not, and we can work on those
Okay,
details.
so, but yeah, everything that else has been said.
So the set number on the roof, I think you're suggesting a number. I would suggest, matching the properties around it. Is that versus setting a number of 27 feet? Because if there's something that's 35 feet, then we should allow it to be 35 feet. If the house has a 24 foot, you should say not to exceed 24 foot, right? Or not to exceed the existing property adjacent or
So
on.
maybe look at adjacency.
Yeah,
not
just so you
necessarily
don't
just-
have this weird like
the
chimney.
bulk plane.
Yeah, chimney thing sticking out of the back over to this other house, and it's the one thing that sticks out. Why not just make it blend and say, look, you're not to exceed the roof height of the surrounding neighborhood or the neighbors.
Well, but I'm worried there a little bit of, now you've got a new structure in the backyard that's looking down onto the yard of the adjacent property.
Well, that's why if
or-
it's 27 feet or if it's a one single story, which most of these are, they wouldn't never be a 35 foot. See, my fear is they're going to put a 35 foot structure back there when the main house is only 24 feet. Or
Oh, I thought you were saying if they had a 35 foot,
Well,
that
if
they
they-
could get away with another 35.
Well, if they had if they had a 35 foot, what I'm just saying is equal to or less than the main
I think
structure.
a lot of times I'm going to want less than, personally.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if the
I don't know if we
bulk
want to set
plane,
a
if
number.
if that comes into play here or not.
The way the code is written today, no, it would
And
not.
how would that, if it was, sorry to interrupt, Bob.
No, keep going.
Yeah.
You're
But
good.
if bulk plane were part of the equation, how would that affect the 8 of these that were built today?
I'd have to look into it, but my guess is it would not affect any of them.
So again, I think to Bob's point, we don't want imposing structures in people's backyard. I mean, for all the same reasons, of all the conversations we have, those tend to be the most important to the neighbors and to the people walking around, so.
Yeah.
Nancy?
I agree with what the mayor said as well, and I think that, and I believe this is what you're saying too, Bob, and I do agree that an accessory dwelling unit as well as a garage should be lower than the house, because I think of a particular garage in my district that was built way over the house heights, and I don't know how that occurred, and it really is disturbing to the neighbors. I think there has to be some type of proportionality when an accessory dwelling unit is being built, because if a house is a 3-story house on an acre or more lot, I think it should be proportional to the size and lot. If it's in a very dense area, then it should be smaller. And I think that, and we're saying it's okay to have kitchens in the accessory dwelling units?
Yes.
Okay, good. And then the other problem that I saw was where you had the ADU is greater or equal to 600 square feet, if we, let's see, yeah, greater. If you have 3 residents, I think you have to be careful again about automobile use. If each of those 3 residents requires an automobile, now we're talking about needing more parking space, and I think we have to look at that.
But Nancy, just remember that garages over 3,000 square feet are man caves. So that's a totally different designation, and those are okay.
Actually, I think this one happens to be a business in a residential area, but that's another point.
Okay, Mr. McGough.
Thank you. I'm most concerned, of course, about the Type A accessory dwelling units, of which we have only 8, but they are the ones that are detached and separate. I think it would be helpful, at least for me, to have some kind of analysis or a photo or something of all of those 8, and I'm sure those will be shared with your committee, but for us to see what they look like and get an indication of what the impacts are of those current 8. It's a small number, but it's what we have, and I think we should have that information available to us. There are several areas of concern. Again, requiring the owner occupancy, it sounds better to me in theory than it might be in practice. Again, just the monitoring of it, and we're referring to this as the land development code, not the land user code. And I think we have to take a look at it to say, what can we live with beyond the tenancy of the current owner? And so I just think there are problems inherent in trying to require a property owner occupancy over a period of time. Even though, again, the number is small at this point, it might be larger, and I suspect it might be lost track of over time. You see, a couple other things on the height. I have a great deal of problem with the height of reducing it from 35 feet to 27 feet. I think it definitely should be compatible with the existing house or lower, as indicated by other members of council. But for example, the very notorious accessory dwelling unit that was referenced by the mayor is, I think, taller than the existing one-story house. At least it's very large, and that one creates a separate problem. Even though the lot has not been split, it certainly gives the appearance that the lot has been split and that there are 2 separate residential lots. I know that it's, by deed, it's a single lot, but looking at it from the street, it looks like 2 lots. There's a driveway, another driveway that comes up. I understand there's even a separate mailbox now for that residence, a separate address, all those kinds of things. I think that should not happen. So I think it's got to be not only compatible, but no greater than a certain height. And I think, what's the height of a one-story house? Is it to the peak, maybe 15, 16 feet, something like that? You know, that wouldn't be, to my mind, not a bad number for an accessory dwelling unit, even if it were in a neighborhood with 2-story houses. It would just simply be even smaller in proportion to the surrounding houses. I don't think there ought to be a correlation between the height of an existing primary residence and the accessory dwelling unit. I think we need a definition of an accessory dwelling unit to be no greater than a certain size, no greater than a certain height. And I think that no matter which neighborhood it's in or how big the lot might be. As far as the corners, I think you've got that just right, that there shouldn't be anything on a corner lot, or at least I think the primary thing then is really the view, you know, obstruction of view. I can envision some corner lots that might be large and the accessory dwelling unit being 600 square feet and being toward the center or the inside of the lot, and it may not create a problem with the view. But I think that's got to be there. In terms of compatibility, I think it definitely needs to be compatible with the architectural style of the existing home. For example, in our older residential neighborhoods where we've got the typical 312 roof pitch or 412 roof pitch, I think that's should be the style with the accessory dwelling unit. So those are my thoughts on the accessory dwelling units. And especially, I think it would be instructive for us to have those photos and kind of a summary of, or summary information about each of those accessory dwelling units, particularly the most offensive one that has been referenced before. Thank you.
Ms. Ford, you had a follow-up point.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, I just want to, two things, but agree with Mr. McGough on the compatibility, because I'm very bothered by, and Mr. Jones mentioned this as well, I'm very bothered by the word similar. I think that what is similar looking to me is going to be very different to someone else. And we have to define that. And when you said modern architecture with, traditional styles, that really, I'm concerned about that. The other thing that I missed before, I wanted to talk about home occupations not being allowed in ADUs. And I struggle with that a little bit, because in my mind, I have a hard time differentiating artists and home occupations. So to me, an ADU would be a wonderful way of providing more attainable housing for artists, especially I can think of, if it's on a large lot especially, and the ADU is a little larger, person could live there, work, do their art, and so forth. So I really think that we might want to look at that and better. What? Yeah, I know, but in our, they actually separated it though. Well, I don't know if ADUs were going to be considered an expansion of business use of home, but under the ADU, you had that home occupations are not allowed in ADUs. And so I think that we have to look at that.
Okay.
Mr. Mayor?
Very good, yes.
We would really like to get guidance also on the deed restriction. Just as a point of policy, I think Councilmember McGough had mentioned with respect to deed restrictions for short-term rentals creates an issue over time. For ADUs, we have the same thing where we're basically just repeating the current land development code in a deed restriction. And we think you can enforce your land development code without worrying about deed restrictions. If you decide to change your land development code, property owner still has a deed restriction. So it's very inflexible. It's a huge pain to deal with when you're the property owner.
So staff's recommendation, your recommendation is drop the deed restriction.
And just make it part of the LDC, and we can enforce on the LDC if we need to, rather than.
Yeah, but how do you, down the road, I go back to what Mr. McGough said, Denver just got kicked in the teeth over, having an event, price controls. And because they weren't in deed restrictions, in effect, where they should have been, and title companies should have caught it, I personally like the deed restriction, but that's just me.
Mr. Mayor, on that point, the issue was that they did have deed restrictions and nobody read them. And the title insurance company said, those are part of your excluded items in terms of coverage, because we found them in the public record. I've actually had an expert witness testify against me in court saying that these matters of title don't affect property values because nobody ever reads them. I think when you're dealing with the accessory dwelling unit aspect, you have a land development code that you can enforce. The issue is in the future, if you change your mind as a municipality about how those should be dealt with, then you can't change your mind in arrears for things that have deed restrictions on them. Affordable housing is a little bit different, and people should read their title work. They don't, but they should.
Okay. David? And it's okay to go against me, honest it is.
No. My pause was I'm struggling with your comment. Nobody does read them. But again, I guess I would still agree with the mayor.
That's not going to.
I'm not. I'm okay with removing deed restrictions.
Keep the deed restriction.
Nancy's?
And I'm still in favor of not having deed restrictions. I think it's a land development code, not the land user control code.
I guess for me, let's do the belt, from my perspective, belt and suspenders, have it both places. So that's just, but we can listen more. You might change our minds, maybe.
Okay.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll dive into
Give
it
us
a
some
little
more, yeah, give
Okay.
us some more information on that. I'm just going
Can
by
do.
my seat of the pants lawyer gut reaction. Okay,
All right, so.
maybe Daley will give me some different legal opinion, who knows? Okay, next.
So kind of piggybacking on what Councilmember Ford started with on the expanded use of the home for business purposes. Currently, we say a home occupation can only occur within the primary dwelling unit, not the ADU or any other structure on the site. And it has to be carried out only by a resident of the dwelling. So of course that limits the opportunities for things like artist studios to be outside the home, or to use some other kind of, use a detached accessory structure for even just your own home office. You want to move it just out of the house into your accessory unit or your accessory dwelling, or sorry, your accessory building, and that under our code today is not allowed. There might also be some opportunities to look at other small scale operations. One person just doing some manufacturing, doing art, doing coffee roasting as an example we threw in here. So something to think about there. So the options to look at would be allowing home occupations to be outside of the home on the lot, but in maybe some other different structures. And to maybe also think about, as long as there's no exterior impact on the lot, maybe there's also opportunities to look at an outside employee. Some communities do allow that as well, one outside employee to come in. So just a couple of things to think about there. So any initial thoughts on that?
Let me, for me, the issue becomes what kind of occupation. An artist is great. I have no issue at all. Now, somebody doing auto repair, that becomes a bigger heartburn for me. And if Mr. Marriott was here, he would say everybody gets to use their property however they want to, and I get that too. So are we going to have some definitions of what types of uses are permitted for home occupations?
Or some kind of parameters around
Right.
what that would
Yeah.
be. So if there's no exterior impact, if everything can be done inside of a structure with no sense that outside of that structure that there's any use going on, then that would be something we would work
Okay.
with. Or we could simply actually put a list of things
Right.
that would be
David?
restricted.
So, what about the person that teaches a yoga class in their basement and they invite 12 of their closest friends over every day or once a week or whatever it is? Based on the way it's written, is that excluded? Or that wouldn't be permissible?
I think you could wrap that into the exterior impact. If you've got 12 people coming over, you are creating
Okay,
a
so then I'm
situation
going to
where-
call it a bunco party. It's a card game, I guess. I've never played it.
It's fun.
Dot says it's nice. So
Fun.
again, I guess, so are we going to now have our citizens lying about what they're doing in their house because they want to make a little bit extra money teaching yoga? I just,
Making money on yoga.
well, no.
Do whatever you want to do.
Well, no, but if they're legitimately teaching a yoga class in their home and people are coming over for an hour for that yoga class, they can't do it because of the exterior impact, because maybe there's going to be 12 cars. Maybe there's not. But that same homeowner could have a party at their house for the same hour every single day and call it a party and not a yoga class. So how do we govern that? How do we, feels like, man, that's kind of overreaching.
Kind of gets back a little bit to Councilmember McGough's comments earlier too about how do you regulate those.
But currently there is, I'm reading it here, the occupations can occur in the principal dwelling unit.
No, I get that, but
So-
the external impact would be the cars.
Okay,
And
but,
so, if a neighbor complains, if we're working on a complaint because of the cars, now code enforcement shows up. Well, you can't have all these cars here. well, why are the cars here? Oh, I'm having a yoga party. But anyway.
So you can regulate the commerce. It may be hard to figure it out and enforce it. I mean, you have to engage in the fact-finding on that, right? Interview the people that are coming out, whatever it is. And they could all lie to you, and that could happen. But you can't regulate the freedom of association. So, you know, you have that right as an American citizen under the Constitution to have a party. You also have a right under the Constitution and under the Colorado statutes to have religious ceremonies in your house anytime you want. And the government can't tell you, even with respect to the impact on cars, people could be parked all the way on the street. And the legislature has decided that that's a matter of statewide importance, so even a home rule municipality can't regulate that. So they could say yoga's religious. You know, we'll see.
Yeah, I think that there's more and more people are working from home. They're probably fitting under the standards of what maybe is written here, but there are some outliers of people that, you know, moms that have a craft that, like a yoga instructor, and they're, rather than going to teach at one of the local rec centers, they're able to do that in their home and stay home with their kids, and so I struggle with this particular one.
So a lot of times we regulate the number of students. So music lessons is another example.
Excuse
Right.
me, Todd.
That's what we do. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, a lot of times we regulate the number of students, and, you know, or if you've got like a psychologist, the number of patients that can be there at any one time, and that's just one way that you can regulate those impacts. It has a sort of a correlation to parking. It's not one-to-one, but it's close enough.
Okay, well, I mean, again, I think obviously I need more information, but again, I struggle limiting somebody from trying to make a living one way or the other.
Sure.
Why am I hearing Mr. Howard, the devil's in the details?
Sitting in his
I'm
seat,
sitting in the
that's why.
chair.
That's right, right. Mr. Pfeiffer?
So I would assume the zoning would restrict, kind of like you can't have a mechanic in a residential area, because I know that's an issue, right? You can't do that. So regardless if there's an ADU or not, a mechanic can't be working out of their garage and as a business, correct?
The way the code is written today, you know,
I would assume
yeah.
that there would be some level of that. Now going to opposite of your situation, which is a real one happening to some people I know, is they're running a plumbing business out of their house. So plumbing. So 5, 6, 7 plumbing trucks go there every morning and then park every night and use city streets as. So how do you deal with that if you want? I don't think anyone's going to call and complain about the yoga instructor. I think they're going to complain about the
There
mechanic.
was.
Oh, there was.
That's why
Well,
I bring it up.
he can
This
shake
is a
his
real
head
life
too.
example.
Well,
Mr. Devon, can you back me up on this?
Yes,
But can you back me up on mine too?
I'll back both of you
All
up.
right.
Because I care about all of you up there.
So, I mean, but the plumbing should not have happened in residential zoning anyway, so I think that gets restricted. I think that we have to overlay what our zone is saying and the use, right? I mean.
Right, and one thing, you know, that we do have a little bit of discrepancy, and a lot of communities do, between like home daycare and home occupations, where you can do a home daycare and have, you know, more of an impact. You got parents dropping off kids during the day, but then then any other type of home occupation is viewed a little bit differently. So we could also look at, you know, making those, bringing those to parity.
Yeah, I mean, I would encourage it. I mean, I think it reduces our traffic congestion, and there's a lot of benefits of it. I mean, myself, as I've worked from home, but I work for a corporation, a little bit different, and my wife still works from home. So, I mean, that's one less car on the road, and she gets to take care of the kids and everything else. And so I think we should encourage it, but within, I think, limits. So let's just make sure we explore all those limits.
Ms. Ford?
Again, I think a lot of this depends on noise attenuation as well, because I think of this person who has the very large garage that's doing auto mechanic work in there, and I think of the neighbor that's next to that neighbor who's constantly hearing the pounding of and clanging of noise 7 days a week. So I think that can be problematic. Now, there's a difference in my mind between a woodworker or sculptor who's using noisy machinery and they're working at 1 o'clock in the morning, then I think it becomes a thing of consideration for your neighbors. So somehow, I would like to see it allowed, but with the limitation of, you cannot impede on your neighbor's sleep or their ability to have a party on the weekend once in a while too. And as far as, your comment, David, if a person has a large lot and they want to have a yoga class and, they have the ability to compensate for those cars, personally, I wouldn't see a problem with it. And you mentioned the child care. Aren't they required to talk to their neighbors to let them know that they're about to have child care and that this is what's going to happen? Or no, they don't have to do anything like that? So, I mean, maybe there has to be some restriction on the number of cars or the effect on one's neighbors, and that also depends on where one is living, because if you're having a party once in a while is one thing. I mean, I don't know if people would do that every day, but,
I certainly don't exercise every day.
But personally, I think a person should work anywhere that they can. I mean, there are writers who like to have a separate place on their property because they want to get away and they want to hide and just have that quiet time. So I think that it's important to do that. I know of...
There's a Supreme Court nominee who likes to work in his barn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it really gets to the point of the disruption to the neighbors, and we have to be practical in terms of what we allow and what we don't allow.
Can we address that some through noise? Does the noise ordinance could address some of that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, because,
Okay.
I don't know.
Ms. Miller?
Thank you, Mr. Williams. I am going to stand with the property owner and the predictable and absent Mr. Marriott on this one. And I would support the home-based business owner 100%.
Okay. Mr. McGough?
Yes, I too would support the current practice or current allowance of letting home occupations occur in the principal dwelling unit only, not in a garage, not the accessory dwelling unit, guest house or ADU, and only by the residents, and that it be limited, that be restricted in those areas: traffic, parking, noise, signage, hours, that kind of thing, which I understand is within the current code.
Well, I will differ from you. I would allow home occupations in a garage, an accessory structure, and ADU. But I would make sure that our noise restrictions apply, and try to address some of the issues in terms of making sure that we're not, a home-based business to me is different than it's become your office in lieu of, the plumbing operation that's doing, he's got 7 trucks there parked overnight every night, and it's just become, just happens to be a residential neighborhood, but now all of a sudden it's become a full-fledged business.
Where people are trying to save money,
Right.
instead of parking those commercial vehicles somewhere, they're just parking them on the street.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Was that clear as mud?
Clear as mud.
Good.
We'll work our way through it.
Okay, good, thank you.
All right. So the last item is about neighborhood conservation strategies. And this is really just a high-level discussion. We know there's going to need to be a lot more detailed discussion about this particular item, because there was a lot of information in your module 2 you had that you received about how this could potentially be implemented. But on a kind of the 30,000-foot level, we've heard concerns expressed about what happens as we become more of a redevelopment and reinvestment city, and are we going to see pressure on existing neighborhoods to maybe upzone to duplex units, have larger homes, actually to just build out what is allowed under the code today with the 35-foot height limit, the lot coverage restrictions that we have today, the limitations. So one thing we wanted to take a look at is within the vast majority of our residential areas, essentially saying they're stable neighborhoods. We don't want to see a huge amount of change in those areas, maybe allow some incremental change, but really try and keep them stable the way they are. So some of the things that we're looking at would be this gets back to what we talked about a little bit with the ADUs, but lowering the height from the 35 feet to something that's more typical of a residential area, which we think is about 27 feet, and kind of apply that across the board in our residential areas, existing residential areas. Maybe we can look at the ways that we allow people to have incremental change of their properties. If they want to do an addition, that's fine, but to maybe kind of better scale that to the neighborhood that's surrounding it, instead of saying maybe you've got a neighborhood that's all single-family ranch-style homes. Do we allow people to pop the top, or is that something that starts to then fundamentally change the neighborhood? So we want to get your thoughts kind of on those types of issues where you think that limit should be in terms of change. And then we're looking at, with accessory structures, not necessarily ADUs, but the garage or the little storage shed. Right now, the restrictions are pretty much the same across whatever lot size you have. So if you've got a 7,000 square foot lot, you can have 3 accessory structures. If you've got a 27,000 square foot lot, you can have 3 accessory structures. It may make sense to allow more accessory structures on a bigger lot, and maybe those accessory structures can be a little bigger, especially if they have to do with it. Maybe you're doing a little bit of your own urban agriculture and you want some bigger structures. So we wanted to ask you your thoughts on kind of scaling the number and the size of those accessory structures to the lot size.
Boy, I'm struggling with this one. You know, I think what Reno Park did for its neighborhood was fine for its neighborhood. I really struggle with doing that citywide. I think that you've got areas where, you know, it could be, you know, and I know people hate the term gentrification, but, you know, sometimes if I'm worried that if it can't be redeveloped effectively, that it's going to go downhill. So I personally don't like those restrictions. Ms. Ford, you're next.
I think it has to depend on the neighborhood. I mean, if I'm a person moving into a neighborhood with single-story homes, I would have troubles if my neighbor decided to, and again, I think it depends. It's a proportional thing. I think it depends on the size of the lot, because you know, if you're in an area where the lot sizes are large, it's not going to impact you the same way. It's going to impact you with your neighbor right over you, and now you're just ruining my son in my garden. That would really be disruptive to my life, to tell you the truth. So I would have a problem with that. And with the larger lot sizes, personally, I think being able to have multiple accessory buildings would be fine. I mean, you see that all the time in rural areas with sheds, and I'm not talking about not necessarily metal sheds, but just, you know, nicely built sheds for containing animals or hay or whatever, and then, you know, to have a small accessory. That's what I would like to be able to do if I had a large lot personally, is to have that freedom to build a few. But again, I think it's a proportional thing, and I don't know what those standards would look like, but.
Mr. Pfeiffer?
Well, the only one that concerns me is, that I like to support, is the first bullet, because 35 feet, even though we say that, every time I drive by a 35-foot building in these 2-story, 1-story neighborhoods, I just sit there and think, oh my gosh, that thing's huge. So 27 feet, it still lets you do what, two-story at least?
Two-story.
So you can always pop the top and still go two-story in a one-story neighborhood. I would support that because I think from scale and size, I think that 35 gets a little crazy that I've seen in several times that we've approved it. As far as limit the amount of increased development that can occur on a lot to maintain neighborhood integrity, I'm not sure I'm on board with that one. Maybe I don't understand it fully, but I feel like you're limiting the property person. So
Sure.
why don't you go ahead and explain it?
I'd like to be able to explain that. Currently, you do have a lot cover limitation, but it's fairly vague. And so what we did was we looked at aerials with the footprints of the buildings and the lots. So your GIS is pretty good that way. We have little boxes inside of boxes. And we took some samples of the largest buildings in each neighborhood on the smallest lots we could find. And we figured out what's the lot cover there. And then we added like 5%. So that even that house, the biggest house in the neighborhood, could increase in size. So it's correct, Mr. Mayor, that it does create a disincentive to scrape it off and redevelop it and fully maximize the building envelope. But we had a lot of pressure at the beginning of the project, a lot of citizen participation where they said, we want to maintain the character of the existing neighborhoods. And that character is largely landscaping in your older neighborhoods because there's a generous front yard, buildings are low scale, trees are mature. You come in there and scrape those lots down and redevelop at your current building lot cover, even at 27 feet, it does change the character of the established neighborhoods. So in those areas built 90s and after, where the buildings are bigger in relation to the lot than those areas built in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we have a different classification under the strategy for those that allows that even bigger building to continue and grow, whereas that same lot size in the smaller lower key neighborhoods from the earlier dates, those would stay kind of more like they are now. And what we find is people will reinvest in those buildings if they know there's going to be stability in terms of the land values. And by that I mean, when the first building pops and gets scraped off and fully utilized, then the rest of the buildings around it are worth the investment of tearing down the building and rebuilding a bigger building. And if you look at Cherry Creek, you can see the last bungalow is, awaiting redevelopment into something giant. And if the Cherry Creek had a regulation on bulk that was different, you would have really, really nice looking bungalows there because again, they still have that great locational advantage that promotes reinvestment in those housing. We did create a zoning district called residential infill just in case we had neighborhoods that needed more because they needed to be scraped off or whatever. And we're holding that just in case we find a neighborhood like that that's not currently stable enough to justify saying you kind of have to be close to what you are going into the future. And we can also keep that in the back pocket in case 15 years from now you have that situation where it didn't work and you need to have a redevelopment scenario where people are going to seriously intensify. Because you do have to justify paying for the cost of scraping the building off. So we provide sort of an array of different options, and we would think that the mapping of it would take care of some of those issues. And if the neighborhoods say, this isn't what we envisioned, we want more, then we have this residential infill zone that we can do, or we can create another category with increased lot cover. But the principal way to limit the amount of increased development is just have a lot cover limitation that's smaller than your lot cover limitation is now. It doesn't say that every homeowner gets another 50 square feet. It says every homeowner can cover 35% of their lot. If you're already at 30, you can get another 5. If you're at 10, you can get 25% more.
Okay.
So that's kind of the strategy.
Okay, I think we'll need to learn a little bit more. I think we need to absorb that because it's the unforeseen consequences that we might create by doing that, and it makes me worried a little bit about the infill zone because that tells me it's an quasi-urban renewal area when you say it that way, and I'm not sure I like that because I could picture like where my grandmother lives in Far Horizons saying, well, that's going to be an infilled area, and how does that feel for a 5-generation family that you just told their home that this is now really like an urban renewal area?
Right.
Not to use that in a negative sense, but what I'm saying is that's just teeing up the homeowners to say, well, you're all going to be scraped.
And there's a lot of ways we can call that, and there's a lot of ways we can adjust the numbers to address the mayor's concern about, where should that balance point be. And there's a way that we can address those numbers by even removing lot cover in certain neighborhoods, things that we would call residential infill, but we can call it whatever we want because we haven't applied it yet, where you can just basically open the cap on that and let people do whatever they're going to do and see where the market goes.
I think we need to
in a
talk
place
about
like
that
Cherry
some
Creek,
more.
We know where it went.
Yeah.
And then you're wanting more information.
Yeah,
I am as well. Ms.
yeah,
Miller?
Yeah.
I struggle with this, mostly because who gets to judge what's charming? that's the hard part for me, right? My husband and I in the same household, he was North Denver born and raised, and he loves that charming little neighborhood that he was in and never wanted to see one of the larger homes be built. And I love those charming little houses, but I also love those big homes that were built. So who gets to judge what's good with the character and what's not? So I struggle with that.
Okay. Mr. Jones?
So just as an example, I've got a rental property just off of 68th and Ward that was built in 1968. So if I wanted to go in there today and scrape that lot, it's a ranch, beautiful little ranch, very mature community with big trees, and under kind of what you're proposing, I could rebuild my ranch because it's going to be under that 27-foot height. I could maybe have a 35% lot coverage as opposed to maybe what it is today, which I don't know. Yeah. Versus the mayor's concern is saying, well, if I owned that same lot and I wanted to come in and I wanted to build a 3-story, 35-foot, 6,000 square foot house, still under the 35% lot coverage, that's what this would prevent.
Today, you could do that one.
Yeah. Right.
In the future, you'd go to the 2 stories, 27 feet.
Yeah, I think you need to talk in the mic so that everybody at home can hear you.
Today, you could build 3 stories. I'm sorry about that. Today, you could build 3 stories at probably more than 35% cover. Is it around, do you remember how big the lot is?
I'm sorry?
Do you remember how big the lot is?
I don't remember how big the lot is, but the house is like 2,400 square feet.
Okay, so maybe on about a 7,500 square foot lot, something like that. So at 35% of 7,500 as your floor plate, and you could build 2 stories on that, you still get a pretty good sized house. And if you're redeveloping a ranch house, you're going to be able to make those economics work because you're going to go to 2 stories if you're going to do something like that. Now, if you're taking a 2-story house and you had dreams of making it a 3-story house or covering from lot line to lot line or setback line to setback line, that wouldn't be allowed. So we want to have, based on the input that we've received, and we hadn't received any opposing input on this point until today, where people were saying, we really like the character of our neighborhoods and we don't want to see giant homes come in and shade our houses out or take over the view on the street where, we're expecting 1 and 2 story smaller homes, and then we see this gigantic 35-foot, covering the whole lot.
Right.
So when you're finished developing all the houses that way, it looks good. In the middle, if you have one of those smaller homes and all the ones around you are bigger, it's an experience that a lot of people don't like.
Yeah, so again, I guess I would also need some additional information, but one question on kind of the lot size and the number of accessory dwelling units. So if I had a big, let's say 25,000 square foot lot, could I just build one 50 by 30?
No, today you'd be restricted on the size of that accessory structure. So that's one thing that we'd want to take a look at if we were going to start to look at the scaling of them as in relationship to the lot
But if you
size.
cut it in thirds, I'm still got my 3 dwelling units that could potentially fit within the scope of the way it's written today. So how do we, again, getting back to I'm feeling dawn tonight, but really making sure that we're clear in how that's written, because I personally would like just one bigger structure as opposed to 3 or 4 or 5 separate structures.
And we have had conversations with people who have large lots who say I want to have a barn.
Because that might look better.
Yeah, I want to have a barn on my lot, but right now our restrictions would say no. You're only restricted to a smaller dwelling unit or a smaller accessory structure. You can have 3 of them as long as you don't go over your lot coverage, but you can't have that one big one that maybe works better for you.
Okay. Yeah, this is a tough one, for sure. But I mean, I think we're talking about the right things.
Mr. McGough?
Yeah, thank you. First, to follow up with something Mr. Jones mentioned. Yes, and I agree with that third bullet point there, to scale the number and size of accessory dwelling units or accessory structures. But I think if it were done by size as opposed to number of buildings, for example, the one larger building may be preferable to 3 smaller, not only aesthetically, but in terms of usefulness to the owner. Mm-hmm. So I think utilizing still making it to scale and making it proportional to the size of the lot would be important. So, the second thing, they're limiting the amount of increased development to maintain neighborhood integrity. Yes, I think, and character. Yeah, I think that's one of the essential functions of our revisions to the code, is to not do great damage to our existing neighborhoods, to the character of our neighborhoods. So yes, whatever that might mean once it gets fleshed out in detail, I think we do need to maintain that neighborhood integrity and character. The residential building height limit, you know, I'm inclined to say, yes, we need some more, I need some more information, but I'm inclined to say, yes, 27 feet in the residential neighborhoods, having that as the maximum height. That would mean that, and we do have, I'm not sure how many, but I can think of a few pop-tops here in the city that have gone from 1 to 2 stories, and although they're much larger now, they don't seem to be out of character, terribly out of character with the existing neighborhood, and that allows for that development. So I think I'd be inclined to favor the 27-foot. I'd like to think more about the impacts of that, and as you bring back some more information.
Okay. I think everybody's gotten to chime in on that one as well. I appreciate Planning Commission being here. I know I've been very rude in not calling on you for your input, but frankly, I think this is one where you need to be hearing what's going on between our ears, and sort of see the gears turning a little bit. So I think it's been an opportunity. I do appreciate Planning Commission being here. I know there will be opportunities for you to provide input during this process, and some input to us as well. But I think tonight it was important to sort of hear where council is on these issues. And frankly, I want to keep this process moving forward. And so I think that weighs into it. I know that we've got some areas where we're not giving 100%, you know, thumb up, thumb down, because these are tough areas where I think we need to get more input from our citizens, from the Planning Commission, from City Council. But there are some areas where I think we need some more information, and I think you got some guidance tonight on where those are. So with that, I see the next steps.
I do have a question.
Yes.
If I could ask just both of you, could you describe how the process is going so far in terms of the meetings, how many meetings you've had with the committee, the participation, and how many more meetings you have? Just like to know where we are in the,
Sure.
I know we're about halfway through the process, but I'd like to know where we are in terms of engagement with our committee.
Yeah, I think we've had 6 meetings with the advisory committee, or maybe this week will be the 6th one. We've already had 1 open house. Our next open house will be coming up at the end of this month. We've had great participation from the advisory committee. We've had great participation from our internal staff technical committee. And the open house exceeded our expectations on number of participants at the first open house. So we've been pleasantly surprised by the input.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Sure. So okay, I'll just quickly go through the next steps, and that is we do have meetings this week with our advisory committee and our internal technical committee, and we'll take the information we received here today to that group and start to dive into more detail with that group. This is an iterative process, so the draft code that is in front of you today is not the end-all, obviously. We'll take the input we got here today, we'll take the input we get from the advisory committee and at the next public open house, and massage that information into the next iteration of the code you see. Before the open house, we will have a what we heard discussion with the community as well. On Module 1, we did receive a number of comments and questions, and we'll be available at the open house to discuss what we heard and kind of our responses to those. We'll also have that information on our website. So we will have the open house coming up at the end of this month, and this is just kind of a quick overview of what we've got coming up over the next couple of months. We'll have some additional meetings with the advisory committee. I think we've got 2 more before the end of the year. We'll have another open house before the end of the year in addition to the one in August. And we'll hope to hopefully have everything wrapped up with the final code module in a draft form by the first quarter of next year. And then we'll go into a longer kind of review period once we have the whole document put together. And just finally, for anybody who might be watching or is not familiar with our website, advancearvada.org is where you can go to find all the information, and it's kept up to date on all the conversations we have and all the various drafts we have. And please participate in our open houses that are coming up.
Right. Mr. Pfeiffer.
Hey, so real quick, is this, so advancearvada.org, I see that you say public review and comment on code modules. Are we really trying to engage an interaction and feedback that's broader than these groups that we brought together? Because
that's correct.
It's like Speak Up Arvada and there's all these other engagements we're trying to do. I think that our net could be spread wider if we allow a portal for people to interact.
We do. We actually have a portal on there where people can look at the code and actually, it's an interactive piece of software where you can actually go into the code, tag what you're looking at and what you have a comment on, provide that comment, and we get a list that says a comment was provided on this particular topic and here's what that comment was. So it is very interactive.
And are those comments being sent over to the committee, the LDC committee?
We will be consolidating those that we've heard so far on Code Module 1, which is what's on the website right now, and we'll be bringing those for the open house.
And for each module, we'll see those too?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Jones.
This is kind of a Johnny-come-lately kind of question or comment, because I've not been in any of the meetings, but has there been any conversation or discussion about lot setback between houses? As you know, right now it's 8 foot from house to property line, of expanding that, and you don't have to answer this now unless you have the answer. And the second question would be street size, from curb to curb, making our streets wider as opposed to smaller. I know that some would agree or believe that making those streets shorter helps control traffic. I'm just wondering if any of those kinds of conversations have come up during this.
We've had a few people comment on lots, side yard setbacks, and it actually varies by zone district. It's anywhere from 5 feet to 15 feet.
I'm in the wrong neighborhood then. Go ahead.
So yeah, there's been a variety. I mean, the smaller the lots you get, the tighter those get. We have had some comments on side yard setbacks in that sense. As far as street design, we just recently, within the last 18 months or so, I want to say, adopted new local street standards, which were actually wider than our previous street standards. So that has not come up as an issue, and we think that's an issue that we addressed, and we worked with the fire department on making sure those were correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I see no other lights. Mr. Devon, anything else you need from us tonight?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you all. Very good work. Thank you to the Planning Commission for listening to us ramble on up here, and thank you for our consultant and for our staff raising good issues for our discussions.